something akin to the regional solutions team or some other kind of coming together of the state agencies and departments to make sure that we're all coordinated on almost like a project by project basis. And where I may be the guilty one that suggested this as language for the strategies, but I want to make sure that it's clear what it actually means. As a state agency coordination agreement is an agreement between the two departments that sort of dictates how we work together from a rulemaking perspective or from major projects that trigger certain agreed upon coordination efforts. But it wouldn't be a very helpful tool on an application by application basis where if there was a specific issue that cropped up in one jurisdiction and they needed the state departments to come together and kind of work it out and figure out what was needed, the agreements probably wouldn't be the tool. We would do that anyways, probably as state departments and coordinating with each other, but the formal process of pulling together a state agency coordination agreement has more to do with major efforts from department to department and coordinating to make sure that our rules are not in conflict with each other. And I don't think that's a bad suggestion. I think it's actually a great one. I just want to make sure that we're accomplishing the goal of the original conversations and addressing the need at hand. So I'm not necessarily suggesting removing this. I just want to make sure that we're not missing the need that may have been raised by the work group more specifically.
Yeah, Angie, I'll just add in a little bit before we open up to the group. There have been a few recommendations about how all or a subset of the players can continue to organize and coordinate going forward. And so I just want to offer a few. One is what we have listed here, which are the coordination agreements between state agencies to clarify roles and responsibilities and how sister agencies operate together. A more expanded view could be essentially a continuation of this work group or something like it, to have players at different levels of government and also from different perspectives continue to meet to help move through issues as they arise. And then a third option, even more sort of robust, is what Angie described, which would be sort of a organ solutions kind of convener to really have some power to determine the solutions for steps going forward. And I think what we're trying to ask is there a preferred language that the work group wants to put forward in order to make sure we're uplifting your thoughts on how coordination works going forward?
I'll also just draw attention to the end of the report where we did sort of like as a next step, because this recommendation changed over time, and we thought it was really important to like have that sort of like next step, like, oh, a work group, this has been working really well. We housed it in the next step section at the end of the report as a recommendation, sort of broadly, to continue working as a work group, as these things might come up for implementation. So that piece is technically in the report, just not a recommendation in the matrix.
So the question before you all is, should we leave the recommendation as is, referring to the coordination agreements, or should we expand it in the recommendations as well as in the end of the report?
Hey, you see Dana's comment?
I mean, I think we could have all three. I think the third recommendation would be a very significant lift. And so I think the work group would need to consider whether the juice was worth the squeeze. But that, again, that's a work group question to discuss.
Because the third option really would be kind of creating a new body of people across agencies that also have sort of authority to make decisions about things, correct? Yeah. Feels.
Just because it's so quiet. I don't think there's any harm in keeping all three and just seeing what the legislature does with that information, since these will just be recommendations and, groupthink carried forward.
All right, so we'll make it all three. Okay, can we move on to the last one? All right. Hopefully this one's quick. We made an edit to the recommendation that reads permit childcare centers by right in residential zones to add the word urban, highlighted there in orange. So it's now, permit childcare centers by right in urban residential zones. And we mostly just for this meeting wanted to make sure that that change was okay with the work group, and maybe DLCD can provide some context as to what types of zones are then maybe left out by adding that word urban, and if that's okay with the work group.
Yeah, I may put Kelly on the spot if she wants to speak to this.
No, I'm happy to. Yeah, so in Oregon land use speak, urban and rural refers to urban is inside an urban growth boundary. And then so what this change would say that our recommendations permit childcare centers by right only within the urban growth boundaries. And there are residential zones outside of urban growth boundaries that are rural residential, and mostly those are, served by, wells and septic. So they kind of have a very different infrastructure kind of context, I guess. But because centers are more intensive use, I think we had been thinking that this recommendation applied in urban zones, but we weren't explicit about that. So we just wanted to add that clarifying terminology in there. And there is no, like in Oregon, there is no such thing as suburban. It's all urban or rural. So if you're thinking suburban, it's probably urban. So it encompasses all of that.
So are there any concerns from the work group by clarifying this and just leaving it to urban residential zones?
Leanne, it looks like Petra had a question about UGB fringe agreements.
Yeah. Petra, do you want to expand on?
Yeah, thanks. We're in a strike right now, so I'm running around the office and listening. So I'll keep my camera off. But there seems to be a third category, land use category, because we have urban growth fringe agreements with the respective cities as a county. So that might be a third category about how the city and the counties work together in the urban growth boundary, but outside the city limits.
Would urban and urban fringe residential zones solve that issue, or does it give more confusion?
For me, it's a question. I'm sorry, Kelly. For me, it's a question as opposed to, a suggestion.
I might suggest that I think by saying urban, it just means it's in an urban growth boundary and it's a residential zone. So if a city and a county have a specific agreement about how they treat lands inside an urban growth boundary, I think they can kind of make, I think if there are residential zones within that, usually that they create a zone that's like a holding zone, that is a temporary holding zone until a property becomes like annexed into a city and urbanized. So I guess I would suggest just keeping it to this language of just the word urban, just to avoid confusion, especially because not all counties have fringe agreements, and there's different terminology for that. And so I think it would add to confusion if we started to add more words to this.
Deanna?
I think I don't know enough in order to be able to make a clear recommendation, and I don't want to like leave out. I'm worried about leaving out rural residential zones without making sure we hear from providers that are operating in rural residential zones and whether they've faced these challenges. Like a couple that are coming to mind are like the one that this isn't maybe this issue specifically, the one that we've heard about that wanted to convert a home next door to her center into an infant toddler care space, but ran into a sewer upgrade, even though the age group that she was caring for was not going to be using the toilet. And there's also a micro center conversation underway right now in a separate parallel work group because one of the things that we run into in rural is you might want a childcare that's only serving, 20 children, but then you have to find like a commercial building and you have to meet the center requirements, which are, even though you're only serving maybe you're only serving 16 children, but you're still having to meet that center instead. So I just am worried about narrowing ourselves in without fully understanding the implications of that narrowing. I guess I also wonder if it's a like concern that's not grounded in reality. Like if you're in a rural area, you're not going to be opening like 100-kid center because is my assumption, because there wouldn't be like a child need for that many childcare spots or a sustainability. Yeah.
So can I comment on that for a sec? My understanding was this was adding to, not limiting, because was it 3109 that allowed them by right in rural areas? If I misunderstood that, then my apologies. So number one, this felt like an expansion of the allowed by right. Number two, your thoughts on childcare in rural areas. So we've actually worked with a lot of migrant farm worker family communities. And so Head Start actually operates a number of large facilities in pretty rural areas. So just something to think about and be aware of. We've done facilities for like 200 kids. Now, granted, these are technically within UGBs, I think, in almost all cases, but there actually is quite a big need in agricultural areas for childcare. Thank you.
I can just chime in quickly and say that there is a big difference between urban and rural zoning obligations and allowances, as we've discussed in meetings past. But just to pile onto what Peter just shared, the statute that dictates what kinds of childcare facilities can occur in resource zones, which is the exclusive farm use zone and the forest zones. The exclusive farm use zone specifically allows for childcare centers and qualifying buildings or facilities, and it has a number of criteria that need to be met, but it does allow for them. I think the question we are having right now about urban is, I agree, was intended to be an expansion on existing language for centers, because the existing language in 329A440 talks about in-home childcare facilities being allowed by right in residential zones, and this is for centers specifically. And so we were wanting to make sure that it was that we understood, or we want to make sure that we all collectively agreed that it's intended to be centers in urban residential zones as opposed to rural residential zones, which would be outside UGBs. And part of the question there is really that it's been raised already, that just access to city services, right? Like ensuring you have a sewer connection or a water line connection or fire and emergency response provisions that are provided to incorporated areas of the community. I do think there is a difference between, so the fringe area question's intriguing, and I apologize for rambling a tad bit here, but hypothetically, an urban zone will not occur in the fringe areas unless it has gone through the UGB expansion process and incorporation process and has been removed from any holding zone designations to be urbanized at that point. So I plugged a little bit in the chat to sort of add context to this, but I think the question at hand is, there's maybe two separate questions. The issue that Dana raised about the rural needs being met, and then also the text on the screen about centers in urban residential zones.
I guess so. For example, in sitting on the Childcare Infrastructure Fund, one of the applications that we read was an application from a person who hoped to renovate a home on a large property in a small town. And so this is where I'm like, I don't know if that is in my mind, it is rural. I don't know if it is technically a rural residential zone. It is a very small town in Central Oregon. And they hoped to convert the home into a small childcare center, like 3 or 4 classrooms inside this home. And so this is where I'm just like, I don't know. From a zoning land use, like, I'm sure that community needs childcare because currently they have 0 licensed childcare, and they could probably use more than 16 spots.
Jennifer?
I would say that I have 3 counties and all of them are rural. And we have a great need for childcare still. The only concern, if we're looking at childcare centers, is are they looking at building a childcare center? And if so, in a residential zone, is there anything in place saying do a needs assessment? Because we've had 2 centers built in 2 of my counties. One of them put registered family and certified families out of business. They promised wide range of hours for shift workers. And then they decided, no, we're going to go ahead and just frame it to the regular, 7:30 to 6 o'clock. And then when the families went back to try to go back to their old providers, there was nothing there because the providers had to close their doors because they didn't have, any children. The other one was very successful because the city and the planning commission, the zoning, they did a needs assessment and it was needed. And they have over 200 kids in the center in that rural community. So, if there is a childcare center going into even a urban or a rural area, just to have them, is there something in place saying, can we do a needs assessment? Can we see what is needed? A recommendation, something like that, because we do have a lot of rural areas that have children that need childcare and could open a center that could host 100 to 200 kids outside of the Head Starts, outside of the OCDCs.
So I think we should probably decide what we want to do.
Right. So
think we're-
one option is, because it feels like we're going back and forth. We could say permit childcare centers by right in residential zones, period. Consider implications for rural residential zones. so that it highlights that there may be different issues in urban zones, residential zones versus rural residential zones, but doesn't take a stand on what the outcome should be. Does that feel like a way to move forward? I'm seeing some head nods, but if anybody has issues with that, please let us know and we'll consider something different.
I think it's a good step for now. On Monday, some of us are meeting with Representative Marsh to discuss what legislative language might actually look like related to this recommendation. And so it's just one that we'll need more clarity on, I think, sooner rather than later.
All right. I think we should move on. Cadence.
All right, folks, we've blown the agenda, and that is okay because this was really a very important conversation, and we really appreciate your input because Echo Northwest could write a whole bunch of words. You've seen us do that a lot, but we want to make sure they're the right emphasis and capture enough nuance so that when the baton gets passed, that it can be picked up. And so thank you for that time. So we're going to move on now to what priority recommendations we want to uplift in the report. All the recommendations that we've been clarifying are in the report, but what are the tops that we want to consider? Can you do the next slide? Thanks. So right now we have 7 listed. 7 does not have to be the magic number. And so we want to spend a little time with you all considering if there are others we would like to add. We could also remove a couple if you'd like. But what I'd like to do is just show that on the left of the slide, right, are the recommendations themselves, and on the right is sort of the totaling of the votes. So you remember at our last meeting, we sliced and diced the questions a little bit, right? What do we want to think uplift that have the most impact for populations such as BIPOC providers or in rural areas? What are the most efficient? What is some other kind of ways to consider what is most impactful, what is most important? And so on the right is sort of the aggregation of what got the most votes total. And you can see that one was the top winner, right? But then we have others that received several votes. And so we felt pretty strongly that it made sense that those ones could be included. But if you go to the next slide, please. You can start to see that there are a few more that also received several votes that were not included. Yeah, thank you, Leanne. 4.4, 5.1, and 3.3 that could also be included if we wanted to. And then I just want to scan down to how the voting kept going throughout. So if you could go to the next slide, and we can come back and look at these more closely. I just want to give you all a scan of our options. And so then you can see, starting with 3.1, we're starting to taper off in the number of total votes. That doesn't mean they're not important, but they didn't kind of rise to the top. And then to the next slide, please. And then there were some other recommendations that we wanted you to think about. So these first 3 are the additional ones that got high scores, sort of the 8, 9, and 10, if you will. And then there were some that didn't receive a lot of scores, but we wanted to highlight just for you to think about before we discount them. And when we were thinking about the different ways we were supposed to view potential solutions, just because something gets 36 votes, obviously that's an important thing statewide, but there may be something that got fewer votes, but will have particular impact on a certain group of providers. And so these are the ones we wanted to highlight for you all. 1.2 was develop and issue official guidance for implementing ORS 215-283, which is the child care centers and resource zones and home occupations to encourage consistent approach, right? When we've talked a lot in this group about how inconsistent approach can really lead to bad outcomes. And then 4.2, reducing the time and cost of the permitting process for child care providers. We thought that would be particularly helpful in rural zones and wanted to just highlight that as another one that could be considered as a high priority option. And then finally, this one didn't receive any votes, but we thought it was important, and it has been embedded throughout our conversations, which is essentially providing funding for local governments to translate materials related to the permitting process, right? We acknowledge that DELC does a really good job in translation of materials and how helpful that can be. Other organizations don't necessarily have the capacity to do that on their own, and could resources be made available in order to do that in alignment with their language access policies and priority languages in their communities. So I wanted to pause here for a minute and see if folks have thoughts about sort of the 7 that are currently prioritized in the draft agreement. If you think that one or more of these should be added, we don't need to add any. And I feel like we could add probably, I mean, 10 seems like a sort of natural way, and maybe that's just my Dave Letterman days, but top 10 seems like a reasonable approach if we wanted to go that direction. And of course, if you feel strongly about some or all of these, we can flex as you prefer. And so I'll stop for a minute, but I would like to say that we would like to get some buy-in or consensus thumbs up about adding recommendations to the priority list, so that we can be clear what the will of the group is.
I just like clarity a little bit on the 6.6. I mean, I understand the materials being in those languages, but if someone doesn't speak that person's language at all, just the paper is going to have to be put back in English again. I mean, it doesn't go far enough if we're really trying to talk about equity. So that's probably why I didn't vote for that, because it needs to have more to it than just these pieces of paper or these materials are in that person's language. It can't just be that, is what I'm trying to say. And it's
Right,
not
so
helpful to do that for someone and then it has to be put back in English. You know what I mean? It's not
yeah.
enough. So that's why I didn't vote for that. But I understand the spirit of what we're trying to say, but I don't think it's super helpful.
Yeah, so Leslie, would you say that to make it more robust, you would say not just materials, but forms, and then also make interpretation services available?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Do you think that would be helpful?
I would say from folks that I have worked with, it would be. I mean, it's not just enough to do that little bit. It has to go further than that.
Yeah. Do other folks have thoughts about 6.6? Fernanda?
Yes, I agree with Leslie that I'm a native Spanish speaker. I understand English very well, but I go in the shoes of somebody that will struggle with language. Most of the times, we have the option to offer other language for the rules or understanding, but then you go through the rest of the process and it's not accessible. So then you're still stuck in the middle. And sometimes you read the rules, but then you get in the website for the form and the form is not translated, or the meetings coming to that, or whoever visits you to make all the details don't speak the language. So there's a lot of barriers related to that. And I face that every time, even if I speak the language is so technical that even in my native language, it will be hard. So just like adding the struggle of understanding another language adds another level of difficulty.
Yep, thank you for that. So in the chat, I have sort of off the cuff provided some alternative language. Mackenzie and Leanne would wordsmith it appropriately. But I would like for you all to take a look at that, and if you think it's something that should be added to sort of the prioritization list, thumbs it up. Or if there's other conversation you want to have around that, please let us know.
I would just say too, because of the technical nature of this work, right? Like interpreters can't just go in and interpret anything, right? Like there are often interpreters who are very specific to special education meetings because there's a whole set of special education terminology and norms and societal stereotypes and cultural differences that are really nuanced. That's not just about knowing what the word is, but it's really understanding that whole context. And so, anyway, there's a lot here in terms of building a cadre of interpreters who would have a specific knowledge base and context to be able to navigate. Like it's hard for me to, as a native English speaker, and all of these meetings are happening in English, it's very hard for me to understand a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, we've encountered that too. When I worked at a local jurisdiction, it was necessary to have interpreters who were familiar with the development process in order to be effective. And so this would be a similar kind of case, I would imagine. Okay. So, why don't we open it up to just to go in a little bit of some order. Let's talk about the top three, 4.4, 5.1, and 3.3. Does anybody have thoughts about these and have a desire for them to be included in sort of the top priority list? Does anybody have any questions about them that you would like some clarification about? Okay, Dana has strong support for 4.4. And I don't know if you all saw it when I was flashing by really quickly in the previous, I think it was several of the top 7 or a couple of the top 7 also got 10 votes. So it would be a natural one to include. Kurt.
Thank you. I may be getting ahead because we're talking about priorities, and my comment may be more about implementation. But as I read these, I'm saying some of these items are things that I would expect state agencies have the authority to implement now. Some are going to require some rulemaking, and some are going to require statutory or legislative intervention, like funding allocations. And it seems to me that those different ways of how these can get implemented ought to be kind of factored into the format here. Some of the things that are relatively low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better term, shouldn't be dropped from the list because they're worth doing, and they should be relatively easy, relative being the key word there, to incorporate.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the recommendations generally are organized by sort of who would be who has the power and authority and responsibility for doing the thing, right? Is it a recommendation for a statutory change that goes to the legislature? Is it a state agency change? Here we're really talking about, and from a work group perspective, what are the ones that we would like those respective folks to think about first and most? 3.3 is the one we already discussed. Yeah, so exactly. So it's already happening. So do we need to even include that in the prioritization list because it's the one that's underway already? So maybe don't include that in the unless we want to have one in our high priority that we can remark is successful before it even makes its way to the legislature. But it definitely could be one that doesn't make the list because it's already in process. Any other thoughts about the top three? Right now, we have a strong support for 4.4, which also got 10 votes, along with, I think, a couple of the others in the top 7. Does anybody have a strong opposition to including 4.4? Okay. No opposition. Thanks, Chelsea. Okay, why don't we move to recommendations to help address rural disparities? Does anybody have some strong feelings or thoughts about whether adding 1.2 and 4.2 to the top priority list makes some sense?
Yeah, so I think that 1.2 is super important. I think that this is something that is an easy development. I think that it would make a lot of sense. And what I hear in rural communities and living in a rural community is that it just doesn't happen as often. So when, you know, people are going to guidance, they aren't getting clear information. And so if we had that information out to all of the rural communities, I think that would greatly help address the disparities. And so even though there's, you know, not a lot of votes, I think that one's super important for rural disparities.
Yeah. And I'll just point out that this is one of the places where sort of number of votes doesn't necessarily mean amount of impact. It just might not have a broad impact. And so I appreciate your comment, Rihanna. Okay, so Gail says that they would support including 1.2 and 4.2, but are curious about what Hillary thinks about them. Is Hillary here?
And Hillary Foote is DLCD's farm forest specialist. And I was thinking along the same lines, though I would support including the recommendation as a priority.
I would just add for the discussion that we did confer with Hillary Foote early on in drafts of this language. And she's supportive of clarifying existing statute, right? And that's it's related to the work that she's doing in some rulemaking to clarify other farm forest regulations that apply to new development across the landscape. So she's supportive of clarifying and a consistent approach, and did flag for us in our internal discussions that many of the home occupation permitting requirements applied at the local level stem from local preferences and local ordinances. And so there is opportunity in some instances to streamline or reduce regulations at the local level that might not be required by state law. So she did express concerns with going beyond clarification and, you know, the other recommendations about making childcare uses permitted outright in resource zones would require additional conversation and future rulemaking and other work to address more fully. But thank you for raising that, Gail.
Okay, so then 5.1 was established state agency coordination agreements between DLCD and DELC. Remember, we had a whole bunch of conversation and triplets came from that one, right? Where we decided we were going to add not just the coordination agreements, but also continuation of the work group. And then also this idea of sort of a more robust decision-making body, joint decision-making body, in my mind is sort of like akin to the HAPO or business organ, some other kind of forum for that. I think my question for you all is, do any of those need to be in our top priority recommendations? Or are we happy just to have them be you know, part of the general body of recommendations we have? No thoughts. Okay, that's fair. So reading the room as best I can, I think we've got a couple ones that to add, or at least to consider adding. And this is where I would like you all to do a thumbs up, thumbs down in the chat. There you go. Are you interested in adding 4.4, 1.2, 4.2, and 6.6 to the priority recommendations? I mean, can we do thumbs down? I probably checked that. I assume that we can. Let's see. Yeah, you can. It appears that I am not much of a thumbs downer kind of person. Okay, that's great. Thank you, folks. Keep them coming. Is there anyone who wants to say anything about the priority recommendations before we sort of conclude this part of the discussion?
I had one question. It's kind of a housekeeping question on the initial priority 7. So I'm not sure. Is that what you're looking for feedback on right now?
Well, go ahead.
Okay.
If you can scooch back to the first 7, please.
Yeah, that'd be great. It's really just a housekeeping question. If we're looking at drum roll, those first 7.
Mackenzie or Leanne, can you get us back to the slide with the top 7? There you go.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are fantastic. In general, to me, like, are 1 and 7 kind of the same document? It feels like it's like a part A and a part B.
Well, one is for jurisdictions and one is for childcare providers. So I would imagine they would be different, but not hopefully contradictory.
Yeah. So maybe it's like, I was just thinking for efficiency. Again, it's kind of a housekeeping question, really. I mean, I don't know that I'm adding anything to the conversation, but I just was curious if that was, like whoever's generating those packets can do them both at the same time with a consistent terminology. There's almost like a third document that's terminology for both, so everybody's speaking the same language, literally.
Yeah.
I could see some efficiency in that, approaching it that way.
Yeah,
So that's really it.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I also had a similar question. And so we've kind of gone around and around internally about that. And I think all of the comments make sense. They're clearly connected. I also agree that one needs to come first, right? The more technical, nuanced, like how are we going to do this, people? Guidance, and then a more legible and from the perspective of a prospective provider document. And yeah, there should be some synergy in the compilation of that information so that we can ensure that it's consistent in its approach.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments about the top 11 that we have now? Okay. All right, let's move on then to the next part of our conversation. So we just wanted to make sure that we took a breath and really thought about, okay, do we feel we've done what we set out to do, right? So we were supposed to take a look at information and research from all over the place, obviously here in Oregon, but nationally, about how zoning and building codes and permitting practices either inhibit or support new childcare facilities being established here. And so we had a whole memo on sort of the state of the world, and then next slide. Then we were also supposed to provide a report, right, about how to reduce the barriers and support expansion. I guess a little bit of a note on the 5 cities and counties in the who are your work group members. There are specific recommendations being provided. They are from the total of the recommendations that we've developed together, but tailored for those areas. We're supposed to look at statewide, and your participation has helped us do that. And the question of should we offer legislative changes? And there are several that are legislative changes as well as administrative changes. And importantly, right, we're supposed to try and reduce disproportionate racial and regional disparities. And so that was part of the reason why we wanted to uplift these other items for consideration with regard to English language learners as well as folks in rural parts of the state. And so I think one of the things we wanted to do is when you take a look at all of the requirements in the statute, do you all feel like we have done that? If you go to the next slide, please, there's a few specific questions that we wanted to uplift here to give you a chance to think about and talk about, to make sure that in your minds, together, we have done what the legislature charged us with doing. So do you feel like the draft report addresses the requirements outlined in the bill? Are there parts of the report that need clarification from what you've read thus far in order to reflect your understanding of the issues and the priority recommendations? And are there anything critical aspects that need to be added or emphasized in order to strengthen this report?
I just added my one outstanding because I think earlier it was said that childcare centers are allowed in EFU zones with certain conditions. And I was like, I thought they weren't. So I just pulled up that statute, which I know I've looked at before, specifically for childcare. And the certain exceptions are pretty, like, that's a pretty significant exception if it's only allowed if you're co-located with a community center or a school. And so I didn't want that to go unnoted because that's that means they're really not allowed most places.
Yeah, and so we have a recommendation 1.4. And so this is, I guess, for in-home care in residences and resource zones. So it wouldn't apply to centers, but it would apply to in-home. Is that?
The recommendation that, let's see, this 1.2 is, it sort of addresses home occupation, so in-home, and then it also addresses childcare centers in resource zones. You're right, I think there are extreme limitations to how it's allowed, but I think this one is about kind of getting clarity on that regulation, because I think it's worded a little funky, and Angie can speak to that a little bit more. But yes, I think our understanding is that it does have to be sort of narrowly co-located with community centers or schools.
I am guilty of having to look at my phone for a second while you while you called me out. You're talking about the resource zones specifically, correct?
Yes, her question's in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, my son's school texted. Only childcare centers, co-located care or school, is that right? So the language, thank you for plugging a link into the chat. The language is very specific. There's only a couple of types of facilities that would qualify for that use. That is how we interpret it. And I'll pull it up here. And I just acknowledge that there are 3 other members of the DLCD team on this call, including Gordon Howard, if anybody wants to speak to this more specifically than I can. But let me scroll down to it here really quick and just read it for you all. Childcare facilities, preschool recorded programs, or school-aged recorded programs that are authorized under the ORS 329A 250. They have to be authorized under that statute, and they have to be primarily for the children of residents and workers of the rural area in which the facility or program is located, and they have to be co-located with a community center or a public or private school allowed under this subsection. So it's a very limited path, if you will, for what kinds of childcare facilities can occur and where they can occur. But it is a path that is available currently.
And then for this recommendation in 1.2, there, it sounds like there is some confusion between how that provision and the home occupation provision interact.
The home occupations are currently the only permitted pathway for in-home childcare facilities to occur in resource zones, the exclusive farm use zone and any forest zones. They're typically the path used in most jurisdictions currently, although I think this could be an interesting discussion for in-home childcare providers in rural residential zones, even though we know that ORS 329A 440 seems to indicate that that may not necessarily be a requirement of state law. So the difference here is home occupations are the only way to have an in-home permitted childcare facility in rural landscapes, and centers are only permitted as we just read through ORS 215, 283, 2DD in those farm and forest zones. I hope that is responsive to the question. I'm sorry again for being distracted for a second.
It is, and I hear about this exclusive farm use zone challenge a lot. Just was on an email thread with someone in Wallowa County that was like, there's like literally zero. I drive 2 hours every day so that my child can be in childcare, so that I can work. So I just want to raise that. I think from a childcare provider perspective, but not understanding all the implications, like there may be an interest in going beyond better understanding the existing statute. I don't know why we would start at 5 years old to say that kind of care is allowed, but we would not start before 5 years old. I think it's too late to like open up a brand new recommendation. I don't know if there's a way to kind of nuance this 1.2 without saying we recommend a change in the statute, because I don't think we're there on this last day with like 15 minutes left. But maybe just further exploration.
I think from what I've heard from this work group and others as a past county planner, I think there's a lot of interest in obviously in clarifying how the current system works, the current rules work, and so we're all being consistent across the state in how we apply it, but also whether or not it's meeting the need, right? I feel like that's what we've heard through these discussions, is that path may not be meeting the need on rural landscapes, and perhaps that's something for the future, the next phase of this work to do a little deeper dive into. And
I wonder if that, 1.2 could be develop official guidance, blah, 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 and explore whether change in these requirements could be, beneficial to rural communities or something.
I defer to the work group for that call, and I'm going to stop talking because we do have DLCD members, Patrick and Lee, in the room that may have additional thoughts, and I should keep more quiet, facilitator.
All right. Well, thanks, Angie. I agree with Dana. I do. But I will say there is there are many groups that would have concerns over expanding any of the 50 plus some would consider conflicting uses that are already allowed in the EFU zones. I'm not particularly part of that camp, but I do support certainly conserving the farmland that we have and not introducing uses that would conflict with the importance of the integrity of our agricultural zones. I think we can do both. And I like Dana's point, and I would support, Angie's comment to integrate. Are these allowances currently under the statutes meeting the need, or are they serving the rural communities as intended, or can we do both? Can we balance the need to protect and preserve and improve our agricultural commodities while still, because earlier in the meeting we heard, I think from Peter, if I'm not mistaken, about how we do see this need in our agricultural communities sometimes pronounced. So I like this, even at the 11th hour, I like this conversation very much. And those are my thoughts. Thanks.
So
can I add one just follow-up comment? Thank you, Patrick. So as important as this issue is, and I hope this is taken in the spirit of just constructive conversation, but I almost don't feel like this group, like myself included, that we're qualified to address this point. This is a fundamental land use question that I just don't know. I don't feel qualified to make that call. I honestly don't. And I've done work, I've done due diligence and EFUs all around the state. And I kind of want to, for me personally, I would defer to comp planners to make this kind of call. So that's just my 2 cents, and I'm just speaking for myself. So I hope I didn't offend anybody by saying that.
thank you, Peter. So in the chat, I posted a potential sort of second sentence to add to 1.2, which reads, explore changes to these requirements to expand access to childcare in rural settings. Again, this doesn't prescribe a solution. It just highlights an issue. If folks like that concept, if you could do thumbs up, if you think that we should leave it as is, and just know that folks who will be implementing that recommendation, if it moves forward, will also want to do a deeper dive into the larger complexities of rural childcare. That is another option for us. Yeah, and Lee's pointing out the tensions, right? If people can live and work in a rural area, what are we going to do with their children? Right. It's tricky. Okay, so right now we've got 4 thumbs up. That does not feel like enough to make a significant change to the recommendation.
I mean, is there any dissent to the explore language?
Good question.
Okay, unpopular opinion here, I guess. I'm gonna say it. We have a real crisis in the real rural communities, especially the agricultural communities here in Oregon. And if we don't explore, right, then we are sentencing young children and families with young children to unsafe situations. I just, as we were talking this morning, had a provider out in rural Oregon in central rural Oregon who is called while we were on the phone, Child Protective Services, to report children who were left home alone this morning while their parent went to go work in an agricultural setting. 3 young children, an infant, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old. Because the parent right now is struggling, doesn't have, is on the wait list, in ERDC wait list, can't afford to bring the child to childcare every day. And they have a childcare provider. Can you imagine if there were no children in care? Kids would be left home by themselves, sleeping. God only knows if those kids were dosed to continue to sleep in the morning. Because, let's face it, 10:30 in the morning is kind of late to have a child still sleeping, especially an infant. And so, this is very real, folks. I'm doing the House Bill 4086 work group, and people are telling stories and sharing experiences about cases where people are leaving their kids home alone. And is that really neglect? If there's no childcare, is that really neglect? Because what do people do? Here's the thing, right? If we aren't willing to explore it, I think that's pretty sad. That's very sad if we are not really willing to explore it. And we're saying we're gonna prioritize a building and zoning over the lives of children, over the very real lives of children. That's just, in my opinion, that is grossly negligent. And so if we aren't willing to explore, we are sentencing children to all sorts of unsafe situations, because if there's no childcare, then there's no care.
Yeah. Thank you, Annalise. So I'm going to take it that you're doing a thumbs up for explore.
Yeah, I put up my thumb up, but it goes away pretty quick, right? When you react. Yeah, I think I was the first one that put my thumb up.
Got it. All
And
right.
we've got to do something here in Oregon around and these parents that come and talk at House Bill 4086. One of the things they talk about, right, is we've got one, I think she's down like in Crook County, and she says, I can't find childcare. And then I have providers like in Lane County, right, who have a building. It's been used as a childcare for decades. And one individual that works for Lane County puts a whole monkey in the wrench and has disrupted care for, I don't know, a dozen families. This kind of stuff is not right. It doesn't feel right. And I understand that we want to keep kids safe, but how do you keep kids safe if they can't even, if they're staying home alone? How do you keep kids safe? They're alone.
Right. So Annalise, thank you for uplifting sort of the needs of our children in this discussion. And I think we've been trying to figure out what is that balance point of, as Alicia says, right? We need to make sure that there are some rules in place to make sure that kids are provided care and safe environments, and we need to make sure that there are enough safe environments to take care of our kids. And it's not an either or, it's a both and it's one of those things that we've been struggling with, on top of the fact that we have laws and land use regulations and ways of doing buildings, right, that are also kind of complicating how we go about doing this tricky business of something that should be essentially an obvious right of children to have a safe place to be cared for.
So I think, exploration needs to occur, and just because you've done something historically for 50 years even doesn't mean that it's right, doesn't mean that it works. They used to stone people in the Bible. We don't do that anymore. People evolve, society evolves. There's There's recognition that we can change. So explore. For goodness sakes, exploration doesn't guarantee that we're going to make any changes, right? It's a very soft touch. Yeah, let's explore it.
All right, Peter, real quick, and then I would
real
like
quick.
to.
Real quick, I just want to respond to that just because I went on the record saying, hey, I wanted to defer some of this to other folks with more expertise in land use. I just think fundamentally, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, Annalise. I think this entire, this entire process is a massive, huge signal to, legislators, to providers, to everyone involved in creating childcare opportunities that this is one giant exploration already. So I just wanted to point that out. It's a huge signal that goes into the system saying this matters and we care about these, these issues deeply. So I just wanted to frame that. My comment was simply that when we're talking about balancing resource use at the state level, those are big, big decisions about big chunks of land. And I just think we need additional expertise when we're talking about work that's already underway. That's all.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Peter. We know, I think we all are understanding that all of us here are trying to serve children better, and know that you're not trying to keep that from happening just because the complexities of the land use system are huge and the implications are big. The good news is we do not have to implement every single recommendation by the end of the year. We just need to make recommendations by the end of the year. And so lots of smart people are going to be thinking about all of these things, and uplifting the need to really pay very close attention to what is happening in our rural communities is a big deal. So we have 3 minutes. Dana and Lindsay wanted to have a couple minutes to talk, and I would like to give you sort of literally 2 minutes to talk, because we would also like to give everyone else on the team a chance to have some last words.
I'll be really quick. I already mentioned earlier in the call that a handful of us are meeting with Representative Marsh. She was the drafter of House Bill 2727, and she's really interested to hear where the recommendations are landing. And she has a placeholder bill that she's looking to fill with our top recommendations that require or would benefit from statutory change. And so one big next step coming out of this process is to identify what those are in partnership with Representative Marsh, and ask her to, carry those recommendations forward to the legislature, so that further discussion and debate that needs to happen in a statutory change process can happen. Well, simultaneously, we know, to Annalise's point, like, it doesn't just take, zoning, building code, and permitting process improvements to expand childcare. It also takes funding for our childcare subsidy program. It also takes workforce pathways so that we can staff these childcare programs. And it takes funding through programs like the Childcare Infrastructure Fund and the Co-location of Affordable Housing Fund to expand access to affordable quality care in our state. And so advocacy partners are working to build a package that will be carrying forward to the 2025 legislative session. And this piece will be a part of that package. And it's been lovely to work with and learn from all of you. I've really appreciated the facilitation and the expertise on the group.
Awesome. Thank you, Dana. That's exciting. I mean, because, sometimes as a work group, you're like, okay, we just worked really hard, and is this going to go anywhere except someone's shelf to gather dust? So it is lovely to know that there's real interest at the legislature to move forward on this. Lindsay, are you still here?
She had to pop off for another meeting, but I'm happy to share updates if you need me to.
That would be great.
So DELC is obviously working with Business Oregon on the Childcare Infrastructure Fund, and round 1 is officially ended as of September 30th. The Childcare Infrastructure Fund, it opened on August 15th, and the initial round was for $10 million. Business Oregon received over 738 applications that totaled nearly $289 million in requests. So they have received they have received all the applications except for from two counties, which were Wheeler and Baker. They will make award announcements on December 2nd, and the funds will be dispersed in January of 2025. They will be awarding projects in 28 different counties, and applications for round two will be open early 2025 and will be a $15 million round. And for round one with the property acquisition, they had 148 applications for that. With major renovations and new construction, they had 112 applications. For minor repairs, they had 378 applications. And with planning, they had 100 applications. So
Boom.
a lot of infrastructure, y'all.
Yeah. Thanks, Whitney. Yeah, I mean, I think that's just great. We know that money can't solve everything, but it does also help a lot of things. So this is good news. So folks, it's 11:01. I wish we had more time for last words and thoughts. I'll open the space just for a minute to see if anyone wants to say anything. Before we go, I do want to say thank you so much for your continued participation, for your willingness to stick with us today, going through some of the nitty-gritty. Really very much appreciate your contributions. And anyone else want to say some last words?
I'll just reiterate my earlier thanks. This has been an incredible work group, and I'm really proud of the outcome that we've arrived at together, and I'm looking forward to being able to share it with the legislature. I don't know if you've already said this yet or not, Cadence, about final input or feedback on the report. There's a deadline coming up. We want to make sure we capture everything and get it right before it goes off for our legislature's consideration. But thank you again. This has been it's an incredible experience, and I've learned so much. And just the melding of the minds from all the different professions and the perspectives on this single issue has just been an honor to be part of it. So thank you. It's been great.
Yep. And on that note, all edits in, please, by November 22nd. Please email them to us. We would appreciate your feedback. And then we'll get it going, finalizing so that it's into the legislature before the deadline. Thank you so much, folks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Thanks all.